TracerPlus Desktop is what is used to configure your mobile forms to trigger the sync. So when you've configured TracerPlus Connect to do a sync from a source to a destination, the handheld is really in charge of what actually triggers that sync to go when a user clicks a sync button. So like you saw in my sample project here on the handheld, which I can bring up, I have the sync data button. That's actually what's triggering that sync process to run. I'm pressing that button out in the field on my Android device, and it's going to go ahead and trigger that sync on the TracerPlus Connect server to move the data from the source to the destination. So when we're in TracerPlus Desktop, we need to configure up the project to sync. We have to add the hosts, like I actually already mentioned, to our TracerPlus Connect settings. We'll take a look at the sync button and how you can configure that sync button to go ahead and trigger the sync itself. So if I jump now over to TracerPlus Desktop, in my project here, my data collection project, I already talked about this previously, but in the project settings, you would go to the Connect settings on this tab, and that's where you add your host. So you're going to go ahead and add that IP address and port, and this is the host that the handheld communicates to when it goes to do the sync. So you just add it to this list here. And one thing you want to note is this ID, which typically in most cases is one. Some people will actually have multiple hosts that they want to sync to. So maybe they want to sync to not only 4.137 to send the product scan data, but maybe they have a different application that they've deployed for TracerPlus where they want to sync to a completely different server, a different set of data. So you can actually add additional hosts here. The most installs only have the one host where they're syncing to a single TracerPlus Connect. So in almost all cases, this host ID you see here will be listed as one. If you added additional ones, it would be 2, 3, and so on. But you can just remember this host ID here because we will be checking that in the button that we click when we go ahead and perform the sync. So on my form, you can see I have a sync data button that I added to that. So if I jump over to that form, my product scan, and go to the form designer, you'll see here's my form that I deployed to the handheld. Again, I just have some settings here like barcode, location, dropdown, and so on. But I do have this sync button. So if I didn't have this, I would be just saving data to the handheld, and I would have no way of getting it off. So I want to be able to offer the user the ability to collect their barcode data, click the sync, give them the option to click the sync data button that would then push all of the records that they've just created on the handheld over to that TracerPlus Connect server, which then posts it to the database. So to do that, you simply add a button to your form using the button toolbar here. You then, on the right-hand side, when you select it, change the button action to be do sync, like I have selected for my sync data button. So to do sync, when you do that, you'll be presented with a couple different properties here for that sync button. Now you can see the first one is the sync host ID. Now that goes back to the host that we have configured in TracerPlus Connect. It's this ID here. So all it's telling the handheld what to do is that when the user presses this sync button, I want you to communicate with host 1, which is 4.137. So that's going to be the TracerPlus Connect server that we want to sync with. The next property that's the most important here is the profile ID that we want to sync when the user presses this button. Now, if you go back to TracerPlus Connect, you'll notice you can have multiple profiles in your TracerPlus desktop project. I just have one, which is labeled as Sync Profile ID 1. So this tells TracerPlus that when the user clicks our Sync Data button, it's going to sync with host 1, and it's going to tell TracerPlus Connect to sync Profile 1. So it's going to go ahead and sync this. So it would go ahead and move all of the source data to the destination for any number of sync processes that we have in our TracerPlus Connect install here. So essentially, when the user clicks this, it's just syncing one profile, one process, and moving the data that was just collected from this form over to the Microsoft Access database here and inserting those records. So if I were to go ahead and do something like key in another record on the handheld, select a location, this one's in storage, a description, product 4. The user's again just using this form to fill this data out and maybe keying in a quantity of 50, hitting enter, saving that record. Now I have 4 records on the handheld. This will actually sync and append those records to that destination. So I'm going to go ahead and let me bring up Connect. On here, I'm going to go ahead and select that Sync Data button again. It's going to go ahead and sync with TracerPlus Connect, push that data over to the destination, and now we'll have 7 records in here with the first 3 followed by the 4 records that I again submitted and appended to this database. But you can see that new product 4 that I just entered is now inside of Microsoft Access. So just to recap there, we added a sync button to TracerPlus Desktop, which we deployed to the handheld, called Sync Data. It syncs with host ID 1 and profile ID 1. Host ID 1 is, again, this 4.137 Windows PC running TracerPlus Connect. Profile ID 1 is the first profile that we configured inside of TracerPlus Connect. So now, just to illustrate that a little bit more, I did want to send or set up a sync that'll send data to the handheld rather than send data from the handheld to this Access database. So what I'll do in this case is I'm going to add an additional profile to my project. I want to link it up with my data collection project here. So I've got a new profile. This one will be sync to handheld. I'm going to add a process to this, and you'll notice actually when I did that, you'll see this profile is profile ID 2. So I'm going to set up another button that actually syncs with profile 2 rather than the first one. So for this one, I'll call it upload product. And in this case, I'm going to select ODBC. I'll select that same database table for this sync just so you can see those records getting pushed back over to the handheld. So I'll select TracerPlus Connect sample, product list table. On the destination side, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select TracerPlus, and I'll go to a different session, in this case, inventory. And now I'll go ahead and set up my mappings here, which will be, in this case, I just have the 2 fields on my handheld side, but part number to the barcode and location to location. Okay, so I just have those 2 fields that I need to marry up because there's only 2 fields in that second inventory session. And you can see that over here. If I were to jump to my inventory form, I just have barcode and location as my 2 fields. So when I sync this profile, it's going to take the data in this database table here and push it over to the destination, which in this case is the inventory session on the handheld, which is the other form that I have available here, this inventory form. So if I click on view data for inventory, you can see it's currently empty on the handheld. So inventory has no data, but I want to populate it with the data from this table. So I'm going to need a way for the user to get that or to trigger that sync. And actually, I do want to do one other thing in this sync. I want to overwrite the data on the handheld. So every time you sync this, it doesn't duplicate the data on the destination. So I have my product list now overwriting the data in my inventory with any data that is coming from this source. So now I need a way of triggering this sync. So I'm going to save this. I'll jump back over to synchronize. I'll go to my inventory form. So now I have a new form on my handheld called inventory, and I want to give the user an option to download the current inventory with the download inventory button. So I added a button to my form called download inventory. I changed the button action to be do sync from my properties over here on the right-hand side. And now I'm configuring the sync settings for this sync button. Again, I'm going to sync with the same host. It's the same TracerPlus Connect install. So I'll go ahead and set the host ID to 1. But in this case, I want to sync the other profile. So I'm going to sync profile ID 2, which is that second profile, which is sending data to the handheld. So sync profile ID 2 is selected for this button. So that's all I need to configure. Just as a note, to deploy any of these settings, you would hit build deploy here. Hit deploy. And then on the handheld, you go ahead and go to the menu option up here on the top left, hit download project, and then you just hit download project there from this form, and it'll download that project and make those changes on the handheld so that you can see this inventory button on the handheld, which I had already deployed. But if I go to this form here, and let me open up TracerPlus Connect in the background, if I were to jump into my inventory form on the handheld, you can see I have download inventory as my button, which I'm going to go ahead and click here. That's going to connect with TracerPlus Connect. You can see that sync happen really quickly, and it pushed 7 records over. When the sync completes on the handheld side, if I go ahead to the home screen for inventory and click View Data here for this inventory, you'll see I have those records that I had in the Microsoft Access database now available on the handheld, and then I can use these for lookups or something like that, where I'm displaying data to the user from your Access database or whatever backend system you're using. Just to try that one more time, and you can see the change in behavior here. Let's just say I wanted to go ahead and say delete these duplicate data from this, and then maybe I'll add a new record here on the Access side, so you can see this getting pushed over to the handheld. I'll do product 5 with a quantity of 80. So now I have location is actually going to just push these 2 values over. But I entered a new record in Access, and if I go over to the handheld, let me bring up Connect in the background, and go to, again, back to this inventory form, I'm going to click Download Inventory again. Now it synced 5 records because I deleted a couple of them. Pushed those over to the handheld, and it should have included then that new record that I entered on the Access side, which is this Warehouse 3 record here. So you can see it also overwrote this data because I said to overwrite, and so every time I sync it, it's not going to create or not going to append to this database on the handheld, but it will basically make a copy of the Microsoft Access table over in TracerPlus running on the handheld, and so you can use that for maybe scanning product and displaying the location to a user, or scanning product and seeing the description, things like that, based on the settings that you have configured in TracerPlus Desktop. Okay, so that's how you configure a sync button so that the TracerPlus mobile application can sync with TracerPlus Connect and move your data back and forth between your backend system and the handhelds out in the field. So I'll jump back over to the PowerPoint here. And just briefly talk a little bit about the extra syncing types that are available in TracerPlus Connect. So what I showed you today, the first thing is the sync modes that are available. So I showed you the batch syncing, which again is moving data from a source to a destination based on pressing a sync button. That is the most common type of setup with TracerPlus Connect. You're getting your data from some other system, putting it into TracerPlus, maybe doing something with it on the handheld, and then moving it back to one of those other systems by then downloading that data back to Oracle or wherever it's going. But you can also run TracerPlus Connect in a real-time mode, where you're actually, through a very similar configuration, you're marrying up your forms on the handheld to one of those database tables or backend systems directly. So it's not a source to a destination, but it's really just marrying that form up to the database table, say, that you want to save and retrieve data. And when you run it in real-time mode, the handheld, when you actually fill out that form, saves the data immediately to that database table that you've selected. So it's not a sync process where it moves data from one side to the other, but you fill out your TracerPlus forms and it saves it to the handheld. There's also a ton of different data providers available to sync with in TracerPlus Connect. ODBC really gives you flexibility across a lot of database types. So it could be MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, Access like you saw here today, PostgreSQL, things like that. There's a lot of different options. It could go to a Amazon EC2 database server where you're running like Aurora or MySQL. You'd point an ODBC driver to that database, and then you can sync with that data to and from like a cloud database in AWS. There's SQL Server, and then as well as syncing with Salesforce, Microsoft Excel text files. A lot of people will use text files where they sync the data they've collected on the handheld to a text file, and then they have some maybe legacy system that'll just import that text file into that system. to process the data that way. And there's also the template endpoint, which I did want to actually jump out of this PowerPoint here and just kind of mention again in the TracerPlus Connect side. So here you can see, like I mentioned, you have ODBC, SQL Server, Excel, text files, and things like that. On the destination side, you can also select something. I'll add a new sync process here. Let's call this one Sync to Web Service. This is becoming a much more common way of syncing data in TracerPlus. They're downloading data into a web service. So you would go ahead and maybe select TracerPlus as your source of data. Maybe it's your product scan session, and you want to send this to a web service. So what you can do is actually select the template endpoint or the template destination. The first thing you do is select a report file that is basically a file that defines what that data looks like that's getting sent to the web service. Most commonly, this is a file that generates JSON data so that you hit a web service with JSON data that can then be processed on that web service and inserted into whatever system it might be. But it could also just be straight text data. It could be XML data, but that file will generate that output that gets sent to an endpoint here in the the sender dropdown. There's a couple samples that come with TracerPlus Connect. If you click this folder button here, you'll see a samples folder. There's an email sample because you can send to an email, an SMTP server, as well as a JSON sample here for formatting JSON data. And it'll actually create a JSON array that gets pushed over to the endpoint that you select. So once you have the file that defines what that looks like, you can add an endpoint. The two endpoints we currently have available are SMTP servers or URLs. An SMTP server allows you to send an email. So this is commonly used if you wanted to fill out this form with data and then maybe send all of that, maybe send exceptions that have been created on the handheld to an email address. And that could be an exception report that gets sent to somebody in case something happens on the handheld. You can send it as an email of your data. But you can also set it as a URL. So the URL allows you to put in something like a web service here, because it'd be just an HTTP endpoint. So something like tracerplus.com/API, this doesn't actually exist, /v1. But you put your URL here, the method that you're posting to that URL, the content type here, probably something like application/JSON, any headers that you want, a username and password. And basically what this does is the data that's sent from this source gets packaged up into an output. And in this case, it would be JSON, and then posted to this URL that you have selected here. So it's sending that data to a web service, which is then consuming that data on the web service side and doing whatever it needs to on that. This is another newer option in TracerPlus Connect. So something you can take a look at if you have a web service that you need to get data into from your mobile handhelds running TracerPlus. But just to recap again, you have ODBC, SQL Server, TracerPlus, Microsoft Excel workbooks. That's actually another common one. If you go ahead and select Excel, you can navigate to the workbook that you'd like to use and select the sheet that you'd like to sync with. And just like you saw with going to Microsoft Access, you're marrying up the fields of data that are collected by the handheld to the columns in that worksheet, A, B, C, and so on. You just marry that up and sync it. And the last option is text and Salesforce to send data to those to Salesforce or to text files, which are generally then imported someplace else. So again, thanks for joining us today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.